Today's podcast is on demystifying narratives about the debt trap with guest speaker Umesh and Vimanga.
Hi, folks. A very warm welcome to another episode of the Reset podcast by the Advocata Institute. This evening, we have a I would say, a very interesting discussion, at least to some of you who might be interested in the concept of debt. And with what's happening in Sri Lanka, I think there generally is a lot of interest in debt. But we're talking about this whole concept of the Chinese debt narrative. And I believe with Sri Lanka's sovereign default, which a lot of people are speaking on, there is a lot of attention on what the Chinese debt narrative is. So we thought we'll have a podcast on this whole concept, and we have a very special guest with us. Most of you who follow us on our social media platforms and all the other content that we do probably have come across and met Umesh Moramudali. Umesh, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on this podcast. And a brief introduction: Umesh is an economist, and he works as a lecturer at the University of Colombo, teaching economics. And according to his students, he's a fantastic lecturer. So Umesh, with all that good comments, and of course he's published a lot on the concept of debt, on a lot of economic topics, and with all that credentials, let's try to have a fantastic, interesting discussion. So welcome on board, Umesh.
Thank you, Vims.
I think to begin with, there is a lot of questions. Let's try to demystify what Chinese debt is, or what the Chinese debt narrative is. Would you be able to demystify this topic for a very general audience?
Right. I mean, to do that, let me go back a few years, not few years, probably a couple of decades. Around 2000, we did not have much of Chinese debt, largely because most of our foreign debt has been the loans obtained from World Bank, ADB, Japan. Most are concessional loans for long-term projects. This changed in 1997 when Sri Lanka upgraded to a middle income country. After Sri Lanka upgraded to a middle income country, these concessional loans, the amount of concessional loans provided to Sri Lanka reduced. Right. So the basic idea is, look here, now we are a middle income country. There are countries that are struggling more than you. We as multilateral lenders or other lenders, we need to prioritize them. You need to figure out other ways to do your development because you are at a much higher state of development than you used to be. So that means Sri Lanka had their infrastructure and other needs, but also that means the country did not have the easy access to foreign money. So that means Sri Lanka had to look for alternatives, and that's where China comes in, right? So China is not the only fairly new phenomena happen in terms of public debt. There's international sovereign bonds, but along with that, particularly through the project financing, we see China came into the picture. Sri Lanka started to borrow money from China to develop infrastructure. Right? There's of course a political element to that as well, because infrastructure development is very much linked to politics. I mean, your re-election or the number of votes that you get in the next election, your presidential campaign, all that are heavily, I would say, in Sri Lanka are affected by the infrastructure development. Now, for that purpose, the Chinese loans pretty much served well, in the sense that there were infrastructure needs, and those needs could be easily fulfilled through obtaining Chinese loans. There weren't much in the early 2000s, but after 2005 or 6, we see a massive increase of Chinese loans. And where this Chinese debt trap narrative comes, in my opinion, is due to 2 or 3 reasons. One is that although we borrow from many other countries, most of these infrastructure development projects were not visible, in the sense that they were not popular. What we borrow from China are quite popular. For example, in 2005-6, we started borrowing for a new coal power plant, right? So that is a big project. when you compare this with a education development project or rural development project, there might be a lot more money when all this money put together, if you take a look at World Bank money or money obtained from Japan, whatever. But when you look at some big project like coal power plant, that is far more visible. So people start to notice that, okay, we are borrowing from China. That's one thing. And then as I mentioned, this narrative plays to the positive and negative sides both. So it could be the case in elections as well, which we witnessed in 2014-15, that as number of projects financed by China comes into Sri Lanka, as a lot of people start to notice that, media also sort of build a narrative around it. Then it was easy to say that our infrastructure development is heavily driven by China, right? So then at that point there was some fear that are we obtaining too much loans from China? Yes, there was a massive increase of loans we've been obtaining from China, and also, as I mentioned, those loans were much more visible than other loans, because those are the projects that are somewhat, that anyone would easily notice. Then there's also significant increase of investment coming from China. For example, the port city. Again, the same principle applies, that is also very much visible. That these projects were very much talked about almost every day in media. So that resulted in building up the narrative that we are obtaining a lot of loans from China. Is it too much? How this leads to a debt trap is in 2017. I'll come to we can talk about like how in detail how this happens. This translated into a debt trap narrative when Sri Lanka decided to lease the Hambantota port to China Merchant Port Company for 99 years. Right, then the narrative was built, which is wrong, is that Sri Lanka could not pay the debt obtained to construct the Hambantota port, so you give the port instead of that. China took over the port because Sri Lanka couldn't pay the debt. That's a wrong narrative. We can talk about it, but that's how this story built up to a level of Chinese debt trap.
Thanks, Umesh. I think you've demystified the whole concept to a general audience. I think my next question is, I think before that I'll mention to our audience that you're also you've also considered a debt expert, but you've also written on tax. But most importantly, you've written 2 articles to the Diplomat on the debt, or is it 3 articles?
There was quite a few actually.
Right.
There was one specifically focusing on East Sri Lanka victim of Chinese debt trap, and then there was another one specifically focusing on myths and realities about Hambantota port deal.
Right. Using that as context, I want to bring out the kind of argument that you're trying to convey. What would be the summary of that argument? Are you trying to say that this entire argument that there is a Chinese debt trap in the Sri Lankan context is false, or is it more on neutral territory, or is there some grounding reality to that argument? In my own experience, from what I have read in those 3 or 4 Diplomat articles that you've written, I think your argument has been that the Chinese debt trap narrative in Sri Lanka has been false. But if I am wrong, you can correct me. But I just want to get what your argument here is.
Yes, I mean, what I've argued and what I'm consistently arguing is that Chinese debt trap narrative in Sri Lanka is wrong, largely because now I've explained that how we came here. The most part of the debt trap narrative is built up around the Hambantota port deal. Now, if you take a look at what happened there, it is always interpreted as, okay, Sri Lanka couldn't pay debt, so therefore the port was taken over, which is wrong. It was wrong because we are still paying the loans obtained to construct the Hambantota port. So let's establish that fact. So no loan was written off. The second point, what did we get out of this port deal? We got 3 things. One, we got an income. The government got around 1.1 billion. I'm not sure the exact number, but somewhere around 1 billion we got from China merchants. So that's direct money, right? That's direct foreign reserve. So what does this mean? This means it helps you to bridge the balance of payment deficit. So more dollars flowing in, dollars that doesn't attach to any condition, right? So you can directly use this to strengthen reserves. As we know, we have a big problem of not having enough foreign currency in the country. What we have right now was there at a less, magnitude around 2017-18. So it helped to bridge the BOP gap. Then also this is also income because you are selling a state asset, right? This means the government gets money. So when the government gets an income, this is non-tax revenue. So that means it can help the government to bridge the budget deficit because your revenue increases. That means your budget deficit would decrease. Again, very important for the fiscal operations of the government. Third thing is Sri Lanka Port Authority was making losses in Hambantota Port. The moment you transfer this entity to a larger private corporation, we can debate whether the CM Port is a private corporation or is a separate matter. But the point is you take it out of Sri Lanka Port Authority's books. So then you put that burden on China merchants. So that means Sri Lanka Port Authority is through Hambantota Port, they are not making losses. So the government each year doesn't need to give money to the Sri Lanka Port Authority. So that's why whole deal was important. It was a very temporary solution to a macroeconomic issue that Sri Lanka is grappling with. Right now, with the ongoing reforms we talk about, let's privatize. Some say let's privatize. Some say let's ask investors to buy some of the state-owned assets. This is the same concept. If you are talking about getting foreign investors to invest in refinery, may that be that, and then or else something like Hilton, which is also a state-owned asset, is the same concept because it helps three things. One, it helps with the BOP deficit, it helps with the fiscal side of the operations, and it also helps with reducing the losses of SOEs. So it's like three birds in one stone. So that's why it was not really a Chinese matter. It was a action taken to address a larger macroeconomic issue. So why Hambantota Port loans were not also a burden, that's also I should mention. That if you take a look at the debt repayments on the Hambantota Port loans, there were 4 or 5 loans obtained by Sri Lankan government, which would amount to more than 1 billion, maybe 1.2 billion, somewhere around that. So you pay these loans, unlike sovereign bonds, you pay these loans in installments. Every year you pay interest plus the principal. So at the time we decided to lease the port to China merchants, our debt repayment burden for Hambantota Port loans wasn't much. It was somewhere around 2% of the total debt repayments. Now there's no way that you are deciding to swap an asset for a 2% of your total foreign loan payments, right? If your foreign, if these particular loans amounted to 40-50%, then you understand, right? Then you can actually bring down the debt repayment burden. But by giving the Hambantota Port to China, that doesn't really have an impact on debt repayment burden. That's why the loans were not taken away from the books. That's why we keep repaying the loans, because it's easier to repay year by year rather than having that burden. So that's my whole argument is based on. What I'm saying is that there are issues with Chinese debt which we can get on to, but this whole idea of Sri Lanka is in a Chinese debt trap, China gave us loans and then taking over our assets, that is wrong, because that also what it does is it somewhat gives a wrong picture about Sri Lanka's debt situation, and it also heavily underestimate our debt problem and the macroeconomic problem. Because if our issues are with the Chinese debt, if we are in a Chinese debt trap, China simply should be able to bail us out, which they can't. I mean, if this is only a Chinese debt problem, we don't need to go to IMF. We can just ask China to bail us out. They can't, because our problems are far, far bigger. So by putting the Chinese debt trap narrative, which is an incorrect narrative, you ignore what the real issues of the economy, which are macroeconomic vulnerabilities, that lack of reforms, the politicization, the serious balance of payment and fiscal issues, all that, right? So that's my interpretation.
Understood, Umesh. Fantastic. I just want to delve into a bit of a different area, because something that you highlighted is infrastructure and politics, and I think the word politics is quite spicy to to the vast majority, and I'm sure a lot of people are interested in knowing more about this interaction. So something that you highlighted here is that I believe since somewhere around the mid 90s, we became more dependent on Chinese loans for infrastructure projects. So, Professor, if you could actually elaborate on this relationship and how it played out politically, and why do you think there was political support to really or political, I would say, yeah, support for us to really go towards China, to look at Chinese loans? What was the dynamics from a political economic perspective?
Well, I mean, if you take a look at the most of the Chinese loans, those are infrastructure loans. And what does infrastructure development means? Not only in Sri Lankan politics everywhere, is it is seen as an equivalent of China development. So the more infrastructure you have, more new infrastructure you have. That means more development that your government has done. So for that very reason, the government wanted to do development, so the infrastructure development, and do it quick. And China is one country which has many state-owned institutions, along with a state-owned bank, China Exim Bank, which can get you done in a fairly quickly manner. And also they don't have much conditions. They wouldn't tell you, okay, your fiscal deficit needs to be this, you need to follow this exact procurement process, which would be the case in a World Bank funding or ADB or in certain other countries as well, or the lenders. And also we have to mention that there's been a significant reduction of, not reduction, that after Sri Lanka upgraded to a middle income country, that infrastructure development funding from multilaterals fairly reduced. They took a stance that we are no longer going to fund as much as we used to. And then China became the easy option, because if you take a look at the Colombo Katunayak Expressway, it was fairly easy for the Sri Lankan government because there's less conditions. You quickly come to negotiations, agree, and then give the entire work to, you just get the loan from China Exim Bank and give the contract to another Chinese company, and they get it done for you fairly quickly. And you see, before the next election, you have your highway. Now, instead, if you do this, it might take little longer. And also there involves a certain level of corruption could also be involved, because you don't have competitive bidding. So that way you run into the problem of having some level of corruption too. But that's not only a China problem. Most of the Exim banks, when you deal with most Exim banks, you will have that problem. But regardless, it gives that quick option. You get the cash, you get the thing done, which really worked for Sri Lanka. Because if you take a look at 2010-15 period, or prior to 2015 elections, there's a lot of development that was done. Even before 2010 election, you could see the highway construction was done, Colombo Katunayak Expressway was done, Hambantota Port. So it's that also the getting the job done part as well.
Thank you, Umesh. I think we can actually take this conversation. This can go on for days. To be honest, we can discuss one infrastructure project after the other, from the port of Hambantota to the Norocholi power plant. And Advocata is actually releasing an online platform that basically summarizes these infrastructure projects, their interest rates, all that. And we also look forward to come to you with more conversations on this area of infrastructure and all that. Probably we'll have Umesh for another podcast. So I think let's conclude this session of this podcast, and also looking forward to continue the conversation forward. Thank you, Umesh, and thank you for also simply explaining this to our audience. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be part of the podcast as well.
You can listen to this podcast on Anchor, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And remember to follow us on all our social media platforms for more exciting content. See you in the next episode.